everybody. Welcome to the afternoon. I hope lunch was good. My name is Daniel Mintz. I'm Looker's chief data evangelist, and I have an admission to make, which is that I'm sort of obsessed with the census. It's this incredibly rich resource of data that's been around since 1790. Like, it's actually called out in the Constitution that we need to have a census, because otherwise, how would you know how many House districts to have? And they've been doing it ever since. And while I don't think that their data management practices are actually from the 1790s, they are also not from the 2000s. They definitely did a lot of work when space was so expensive that you could only name variables with 8 characters, right? So a lot of like PEDUCA is the education variable, obviously. And then they did fun things like instead of putting the actual level of education in the data, they'd put a number in the data, like 33. And you're like, oh, the education level is 33. And then you'd go to the code book, which was a totally separate file and has to be generated separately, to tell you that 33, of course, as everyone knows, means that the person completed first grade or less. 34 is second grade, 35, and so on, right? But so that's the kind of data that we're dealing with. But it's frustrating because it's such, you like know that there's this incredibly rich resource, but it's locked away in a way that's very hard to access. And so because I'm obsessed, I've been trying to sort of unlock that data for now 3-ish years. And have done some work on that, and I want to share some of that work. But to give you a sense of sort of just a quick overview of the census, most people, when they think of the census, they think of the Decennial Census, which is the every 10-year one. It's going to happen in 2020. It's a big deal. You should fill it out, because you are legally required to fill it out, as is every person in the United States, unless you came from international land, in which case you do not have to fill it out, and you should not fill it out. But that's the Decennial Census. So everybody knows about that, or when they hear census, that's what you think of, right? But there's actually other data products that the census also produces. There's the current population survey, which everybody is familiar with, even though you probably don't know that, because it's done monthly, and when the unemployment rate is released every month, that's actually what they're using. They're using the current population survey, where they ask things like, are you currently working? If you are working, are you working full-time? If you are not working full-time, do you wish to be working full-time? Are you seeking employment? Things like that. And so that's very granular in terms of time, since they do it every month, and they hit a sample of Americans every month. But it is not very granular in terms of geography, because they don't ask enough people to really get down to the very deep levels. There's another data product called the American Community Survey, which is kind of the opposite. It's only done once a year. But they release the data in an extremely geographically granular form, down to what they call a census block group. The ideal census block group is about 1,200 people. So in a city, it's a couple of square blocks. Because they have real concerns about the anonymity of the data, they will only release it in 5-year increments. So when you talk about the 2010 ACS, the 2010 American Community Survey, what you're actually talking about is the aggregated data from 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, and 2010. So if you want to get really granular geographically, you have to sort of take a hit on the time span. But it's really fascinating stuff. And it's a lot of data, like many, 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 many terabytes of data. Unfortunately, as I said, their data management practices, understandably, are a little old. So instead of giving it to you in a big, powerful data warehouse in the cloud that can easily munge terabytes of data, they give you CSVs and Excel files. The way that you access the ACS data is you stitch together 122 Excel files horizontally to make one extremely wide table. And each row of the table corresponds to a geographic unit. Could be a city, it could be a state, it could be a county, it could be a block group. And then they tell you 122 tables wide of facts about that geographic unit. If any of you are data people, which many of you are, you're cringing right now, which is good. You should be cringing. It is cringeworthy. And so that's frustrating if you want to actually ask questions of the data, because it's not very easy to stitch together 122 Excel files, and then also it's many hundreds of millions of rows tall. So it's relatively big data. It's very wide data. And so I, in my obsession, have been trying to sort of untangle it and reshape this data to make it a little bit more manageable. And the reason that they make it in this crazy wide table format is because they will tell you certain combinations of things. They will tell you about people by age, race, and ethnicity at the same time. Or they will tell you about education and income levels at the same time. But they won't tell you about ethnicity, race, age, income level, and education. And the reason is because they don't want to tell you there is a 43-year-old Asian woman who has a master's degree who makes about this much in this block group. Because then you go, oh yeah, it's Sally. Yeah, I know Sally, right? So they're trying to avoid that. So that's why they do this. So fundamentally, to use the language of like business intelligence, what they have done is they have cubed the data, but they've pre-cubed it in about 1,500 different ways. And then they give you 1,500 cubes. Makes it kind of hard to traverse that data. But again, I, in my obsession, have kind of untangled it and not quite uncubed it, but at least gotten a handle on how the cubes are organized and how you can move through the data. And so by doing that, we can actually start to learn some stuff. So since we're in San Francisco, and since the Bay Area and Silicon Valley and San Francisco are going through some pretty rapid demographic changes right now, I thought it would be interesting to look at some of the data behind it and see if there's anything sort of surprising. How many people are from the Bay Area? Okay, like 6 people are from the Bay Area. So for those of you who are not from the Bay Area, do you know that San Francisco is currently going through like pretty rapid yes? You are familiar with this. Okay, good. That's a good baseline. We've got a good starting understanding. So we're going to go further than that. But that's kind of the goal here. And actually, because I live in New York, and I wanted to see my neighborhood, and I wanted to see San Francisco, and really, once you're going to do 2 neighborhoods, you might as well just do all the neighborhoods. We have all the neighborhoods. So we have the entire United States. And if you go to the Data for Good section afterwards, you can ask any question that your heart desires about where you live and how it's changing over time. But for now, because we're in San Francisco, I'm going to talk about San Francisco. So let's go to the computer. So what we're looking at here, I picked out the 3 counties that make up the sort of core Bay Area Silicon Valley. So San Francisco County, which is where we are, Santa Clara County, which is sort of the core Silicon Valley, and San Mateo County, which is where San Jose is. And what I mapped here, or what I graphed, is the change in population from the 2010 ACS, which remember is 2006 through 2010, to the 2016 ACS, which is the most recent release, so that's 2012 through 2016, by age. So on the bottom, on the x-axis, we have age, going from under 5 years over here to all the way 85 years and over. Big growth in the 85-year and over area, fascinatingly. But I think the story that this tells, one part of it is very sort of what you would expect, knowing a little bit about what's going on right now, which is that not a ton of growth in the sort of teenage, 20, early 20s, college-age kids. It's probably too expensive for them. But get into the 25 through 29, 30 through 34 area, and sure enough, quite a lot of population growth there. The thing that surprised me, and I got the right answer because I have an expert who's going to join me in a few minutes, and she actually knows what's happening on the ground and she was like, oh yeah, I know exactly what's happening there, is that there's actually huge growth in people in their sort of early retirement years, the 60s, all the way up to 70, and then it starts to sort of drop off, and then people, I guess, are just living longer, and that's why that's on the way up. But so that was interesting. That was an interesting place to start. So the next thing I looked at was I went way back to 2010, to the 2010 one, and I mapped the block groups that have a median income of $150,000 or more, which, if you've forgotten your 3rd grade math, median means more than half of the households in this block group make more than $150,000. And the darker green it is, the more they make. So the census tops out at $250,000. If your median household makes more than $250,000 a year, they're like, all right, we're done with you, and you just make a lot of money. So this is the map from back in 2010. As you might expect, the Facebook millionaires are there in Palo Alto. The Google millionaires are down there in Los Gatos and Mountain View. Little bit around Burlingame, there's a beautiful sort of hillside community that goes down to SFO. Not a ton going on in San Francisco in terms of these extremely rich areas. But if we then advance to 2011, I'll do that real smooth, you can see. Gets a little bit darker and a little bit bigger. So we go from 182 block groups that match that criteria to 214, so a little bit of growth. And we can move forward to 2012. So I'll just go real quick. There's 2010, 2011, 2012. So we're getting bigger and bigger, more and more folks who meet these criteria. And then if we jump ahead to 2015, now we're up to 311 block groups that match that criteria. So here's 2012, here's 2015, getting darker and getting more prevalent, and San Francisco is now very much on the map. And then if we come forward to 2016, it's really dark green. We're at 365 block groups that meet the criteria. Lots going on in San Francisco. We can zoom in on San Francisco to see exactly what's happening and where these very well-off folks are moving. Lot going on in Potrero Hill and the Dog Patch. This is sort of older money, I would say, but Kim will know more about that. Folks living up by the Presidio. So, big changes happening here. And remember, this data is it's averaged over 2012 to 2016. So we're not nearly in the sort of heart of this change yet. That will come over the next few years as we see that data. Big changes happening here. These are really, really well-off folks. The median household income in the United States is somewhere about $55,000. So these people are making almost 3 times as much as the median household. We can also look at housing growth because there's a lot more demand for housing. More people are coming. So each of these purple spots is an area of the city that has seen housing growth between the 2010 release and the 2016 release, right? So that doesn't look so terrible. Over here in Mission Bay, we've got 80% growth from 2010 to 2016 in terms of how many housing units they have. Apparently, Golden Gate Park has had huge growth. I don't think that they mean tents, but they well could. But it was probably a pretty small base number to start with. But the thing that's actually more troubling is if you look at that map of the places that are growing, this is the opposite math. These are places that have lost housing units in that same period. So very, very, very little housing growth happening. We can also look at what kind of housing growth we're getting. So we can look by number of bedrooms. What are being built in those 3 counties, right? And lots of no-bedroom studios being built, right? Though in San Francisco, really very little of anything being built except 4-bedroom houses, which I think there are not that many of them to grow from. But you've got actual loss of 1-bedrooms and 2-bedrooms in San Mateo County. So at a time when there's unprecedented demand for people to live in this area, you've got housing that's basically flat or even falling off, except for studios. So not exactly a family-friendly place to move unless you have a whole lot of money. We can also look at who is coming to San Francisco, what the population change has been. So we're looking just at San Francisco now. One thing to know about the census is that race and ethnicity are defined differently. So if you are Hispanic, that is your ethnicity. If you are white, that is your race. So you can be a white Hispanic, you can be a white non-Hispanic, you can be a black Hispanic, you can be a black non-Hispanic, and so on and so forth. Folks who I know who are Hispanic get kind of annoyed or confused by this because they're like, I'm Hispanic, that's what I am. And I think that actually is even showing up in the data. I think that these 2 bars are actually a weird data artifact where a bunch of people who had been classified as white Hispanic are being reclassified as some other race Hispanic. But so I don't think this is real growth. I think that's just people moving from this bar to this bar. But these 3 areas clearly do have real growth. So Asian alone, not Hispanic, huge growth there, 21,000 more people. White alone, non-Hispanic, 18,000. Mixed race, 2 or more races, non-Hispanic, 10,000 growth. And then African American actually dropping off, so losing part of the black community here in San Francisco County. We can dig even deeper because with 1,500 cubes, there is a lot of information here. So we can look at the specific origin of Hispanic folks and figure out exactly where they came from and which communities are growing, which aren't. I know this is kind of hard to see. I will zoom in. So we can look at the Mexican community, which is the biggest Hispanic community here in San Francisco, and we can see that it's grown about 6%, 5.9% by 3,600 people. This 7% growth, that's just the whole group of non-Hispanic folks. Huge growth in the Paraguayan community and Uruguayan community, 266%, but that was only 32 people. So, so you can get really, really granular. If you want to figure out where to have great Paraguayan food in San Francisco, you could run a map on that and see where they live and go visit them. We can also look more broadly. I was curious, looking at those places where the median income is $150,000 or above. I said, well, how rare is that more broadly? And it turns out most cities, big cities, do in fact have some clusters of that. Here's New York City, which, not surprisingly, for folks who know New York, Connecticut, Westchester, parts of the North Shore of Long Island, North Jersey are doing pretty well for themselves. We can look up, if the Wi-Fi is fast enough, we can look up in Boston and see what's going on up there. I'll wait while that loads. This is just fascinating data. It gives us a really interesting way to understand the changes that are happening, not just here in San Francisco, but more broadly across the United States, because you can type in your zip code and see what's happening in your zip code. So I really encourage you to go check out the Data for Good table afterwards if you want to understand what's happening in your area. There are folks there who can walk you through it and get you started, and then query to your heart's content. We'll cover the bill with BigQuery because it's cheap, even though it's many terabytes of data. And they're also over there, we are packing kits for Lava Mae, which is this amazing local charity that has these mobile shower units. So packing toiletry kits for homeless folks. After they take a shower, they get toiletries to take with them. So please help us do that. So this data is one way to look at what's happening, but it is only one way. And I think to really understand what's happening, you need to sort of look at other kinds of data. And I think one of the most important ones to look at is the data about what people are experiencing on the ground. And so when I thought about who I would like to talk to, who could actually give me a unique perspective on that, Kim My Cutler came to mind because she wrote a 13,000-word magnum opus on the housing crisis that involves burrowing owls and vomiting anarchists, which I highly recommend you read for TechCrunch back about 4 years ago. It's an amazing read. She's a partner at Initialized Capital. She's on the board of the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition and Spur. She is deeply involved in the stuff that is happening in the city right now. And so I want to bring Kim to the stage to chat about that.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming. So let's establish your credentials. So you wrote a 13,000-word magnum opus.
Yeah.
And how long have you lived in this area?
I've lived in the Bay Area most of my life. I'm actually third-generation Bay Area resident, fourth-generation Californian. And I'm one of the very few people who's grown up I grew up in Silicon Valley. So my dad worked in the industry, my grandfather worked in the industry. I think there are very few people over the course of my career that I've met that kind of fit that. Maybe like 2 or 3 people have roots.
So you are not a newcomer.
No.
Yeah, you definitely understand what. And I mean that must be an amazing perspective to have seen the change to the area.
Yeah. So when I was a kid, I grew up in Cupertino, which is the suburb where Apple is headquartered. And so when I was like 6 or 7 years old, that company was run by Gil Amelio, and it was before Steve Jobs had returned to run Apple, before the iMac, the Bonnie Blue iMac. And at that time, Apple offices were closing down. They were subleasing them to other companies because the company was doing that poorly. And I know that's really hard to kind of imagine that, like, what the physical lived environment of the South Bay was at that time. But it was a world away from what it is today, where Apple's now, a $1 trillion company.
With a spaceship.
With a $5 billion Norman Foster campus in Cupertino. So, yeah.
Cool. So that definitely gives you a perspective. And then you're deeply involved in sort of particularly the San Francisco community and the housing action there.
So I, after I wrote that piece 4 years ago, I had no prior kind of involvement in urban planning or city design. I basically went from zero, and I was like, having grown up here, I was kind of like, why is our transit system dysfunctional? Why are there so many people without housing and shelter in the heart of one of the wealthiest cities in the country? Why, when you go to the South Bay, are there a bunch of strip malls and single-family homes when clearly there's a lot of job creation happening there? And so after I wrote that article, it galvanized a lot of people to get involved from different angles. And so I tried to kind of span my involvement across like different segments of housing accessibility and affordability in general. So on the board of Spur, that's a 100-year-old organization that focuses on good governance and urban planning and land use and transit and housing in the Bay Area. But I also was appointed by the late Mayor Ed Lee to San Francisco's local coordinating homeless board, which oversees all the federal funding that's spent on homelessness in the city as well.
Got it. And so, I won't ask you to summarize a 13,000-word article, but obviously, and folks, I really do encourage folks to go read the article. It's amazing. But it obviously is an extremely complex issue, right?
Yes.
There is not a quick fix, because if there were, someone would have thought of it and done it. What are some of the biggest factors that just make this housing crisis and the whole affordability crisis so acute here?
So we're at a very broad level. I think there is one kind of fundamental contradiction that is really at the heart of American housing policy that you can also see in other countries with other similar systems like United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, which is you can't fundamentally have housing be a fantastic investment and also remain affordable over multiple decades and generations at the same time. But people expect it to do both of those things. And so, in a very complicated city and urban environment like the Bay Area, and also other complicated metro areas in this country, we try and do all of these kind of strange workarounds around it. We protect, neighborhood character in neighborhoods by, protecting the zoning and limiting the amount of housing that can be built, which also makes some good investments. And then we also try to make new housing cross-subsidize affordable housing. And we're not only building not enough housing generally, we're also not producing enough, income-restricted affordable housing at the same time.
Yeah. And I think that core contradiction of I'm going to put my life savings into this.
Be highly leveraged.
Right. I'm going to make the biggest purchase of my life. Yeah. And also people need places to live.
Right.
Is very tricky. And particularly as I think the country to some extent has re-urbanized, right? Coming out of the sort of high crime years.
Yeah, we've against this housing policy contradiction is also the structure of the job market here, right. and changes in the job market, which is like, if when my parents were working in the industry, when I was growing up, like there was literally like a publication that they would get in the mail that would show the different awards you would get if you spent 25 years or 30 years at Hewlett Packard. You would get like a mantelpiece, like a clock you could put on your fireplace. And you just think about something like that today and you're like, that sounds insane. Like right. People are changing jobs every 2 to 3 or 4 years or 5 years or whatever. And so from that perspective, if you don't know what your job is going to be in 5 years, it makes sense to go to a thick labor market with a lot of job opportunities so that if something doesn't work out, there's a bunch of other things that you can kind of jump on. Right. And I think that in part is what is attracting people back to cities, because you want to be adjacent to like a very rich, thick labor market.
Right. Though I can say, as somebody who lives in a city with a failing transit system, you make choices about where you're going to live based on what
Jobs.
Subway line it's near, so which job you can get, and even within an urban core, right? I mean, and certainly for anybody who's driven in the Bay Area recently, or tried to take BART across the Bay, it is packed, and so you live one place because, well, I'm working in the city, and then you get your next job, and it's in the South Bay, and all of a sudden your commute from Oakland doesn't seem like such a good idea anymore.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it is a core. It's the kind of thing someone could write 13,000 words about.
Yeah.
So, so how has the? I mean, I think we hear a lot about sort of two extremes: the sort of super tech wealth and what that is doing to the city and to the Bay, and also about the poorest folks here and how they're affected and the homelessness crisis. But there's also, there are a lot of people in the middle, right? And I asked you earlier about that chart showing that there's huge growth in the sort of people in their 60s. What's going on there?
So I think California's property system really, really strongly biases towards, encouraging people to age in place. So basically, in 1978, the voters of the state passed an initiative called Proposition 13, which basically indexes your property tax rate to the price you paid for your house. And then if you move to somewhere else, and that house is, what houses cost today, your property tax rate is going to be tied to that. And so what that does is it incentivizes people to, trade over or move houses less frequently. And I think our turnover rate is probably like half. I want to say it's half. I mean, I think I'm probably going to get this wrong, but if I remember correctly from the Legislative Analyst's Office report for California, in the 70s we used to have a turnover rate of maybe 12%, and now it's more like 6, I want to say, a year, statewide. And then if you look at San Francisco, the turnover rate is even lower than that. So in SF, like maybe 5,500 existing units trade hands a year or get sold a year, which is, it's not that many. So you divide that by the number. Yeah, for a city of 900, close to 900,000 people. If you go down to the South Bay, like in Palo Alto or Cupertino or any of those communities, there may be like 30 to 50 homes for sale at a given time. And so if you're doing that, and that's against the backdrop of like, here's $1 trillion company's headquarters, those houses can be really expensive. So people are kind of, what you have are these communities that are kind of aging in place. They're empty nesters. Their kids have moved out. They're in this house that is larger than what they need. Perhaps, I don't know, whatever people need. But
if
to
they
move,
paid
if they
$50,000,
moved, their tax rate would go up significantly.
Right.
And so people are kind of induced to stay in place.
Because if they bought their house for $50,000 40 years ago, now it's worth $1 million. They could sell it for $1 million and buy another $1 million house, but they have their property taxes.
The property taxes would go up. And so what it's doing, particularly in the South Bay, is it's younger families can't break into those. They can't like purchase in those markets because it's too expensive. So if you look at school district enrollment rates in the South Bay, like in Cupertino and San Jose, they're declining for elementary schools just because families with young children can't afford it. So.
Even though it is literally probably the most desirable place to live in the country, people can't move into it. Yeah, that sounds problematic.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, so the map that I showed about where housing has grown in San Francisco and where it's fallen off, what's the sort of on the ground explanation for that?
Sure. I mean, so if you look at, this is actually typical of most American cities, like the way that we do city building in this country, which is distinct from how other countries do it. We use an approach that is built around what's called Euclidean zoning. So we separate industrial, commercial, and residential, which is different than how a lot of European cities do it. So European cities will engage with mixed-use zoning, where you might have retail and like commercial in the same place as residential. So because we separated them out, you end up with discrete parts of the city that are meant for distinct purposes. But as the country deindustrialized and manufacturing jobs shift over to knowledge and service jobs, you ended up with these industrial spaces that had no one on them. But except for kind of disused, not no one on them, but like a lot fewer people.
Right.
I should clarify.
Yeah.
Fewer people than in a conventional residential zone, and so those areas became the easiest places to generate the political will to create housing. So if you look at Mission Bay,
not a built-in community.
There's not an existing large community there to oppose any type of new housing construction. So in San Francisco, that would be District 6. That would be the SoMa area, which used to be a bunch of warehouses. And generally, District 6 has been the place in the city where it's just been easiest to get towers approved because there's just less opposition.
Got it.
It also happens to be a liquefaction zone. So
You should probably explain what a liquefaction zone
so
is.
like in an earthquake, we are on a couple major faults. It means the land underneath during a major seismic event would start to liquefy.
And that's bad.
That's bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not a good place to live.
No,
Yeah.
it's not. But yeah.
And yet that's where the housing
Yeah,
has been built.
and then there's a lot of stories. There's actually a lot of stories this week in the New York Times and the LA Times that were focusing on people without housing or street life in the district.
Yeah.
This is another kind of political reality of the city, which is like that area is also the area where a lot of services are located in a de facto way. So services for people without housing, low income, residents of some of these SROs. And so, when people come to the city and they're not familiar with it and they see like, oh, here's this like crazy high rise and then there's this person next to this building, it's because that's the only place that we allow, both a large number of shelters and a large number of new condos. And like the rest of the city is kind of de facto understood to be off limits to that. So,
And that's in part because of sort of NIMBYism and the fact that the communities in those places have a sort of strong foothold and there's local control and local say-so.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of residential neighborhoods are highly organized. If you are an elected official and you want to win in those communities, I mean, you're going to have to be very responsive to whatever neighborhood organizations are telling you, and that may be. They might be organizing against a new apartment building, or they might be organizing against, say, a navigation center for the homeless.
Right. That makes sense that those two things.
Yeah.
And so then folks move in, they're like, aha, beautiful new high rise.
Yeah.
And also there's a homeless shelter next door, which they are not happy about because that's not what they expected. But also like that's kind of, life in a city.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's life in a city.
Things are right next to each other.
Yeah.
And so, I totally forgot what I was going to ask. I'll ask something else.
Yeah.
So I mean, there are. It was also interesting to sort of look at, and you hear a fair amount about the sort of ethnic communities, the Mexican community and the Hispanic community in the Mission. The Asian communities around Japantown and Chinatown. What is like? How has this? I mean, I feel like you hear a fair amount about the Mission and folks getting sort of pushed out of the Mission.
Yeah.
I think I hear less or I read less about Japantown and Chinatown. How is that? How have those communities sort of experienced? Not that I'm asking you to sort of speak on behalf of them, but from your vantage point, what do you see?
I don't feel like I know. I'm like close to the ground enough to to speak for a lot of the Chinatown organizations, but I can say that like as an Asian American, again, if you look at the history of American cities, non-Chinese Americans and Chinese Americans were not effectively allowed to purchase housing outside of Chinatown until 1945 or so.
Wow.
You could read that. I think there is I'm not going to remember the title of the book right now, but so if you look at pre-World War II Asian American neighborhoods, they tend to be in the urban core, and then post-1965 neighborhoods. And 1965 is the year that this country passed the Hart-Celler Act, which changed immigration policy. Post-1965 Asian American communities tend to be more suburban. And so like that, kind of explains like when you look at the West Side neighborhoods, which are more suburban, which were built in the 1950s and 60s and stuff out in the Sunset in Richmond.
Yeah.
There are also large Asian American populations there. There are also large Asian American populations in the South Bay and parts of the East Bay. But like Chinatowns, and I mean, I will say like from having conversations, say with leadership in China, in Vancouver's Chinatown and other Chinatowns, gentrification is a real issue in all of these Chinatowns all over the country in North America. Yeah,
and I mean, to that point of not being allowed to sort of own, I do feel like there's also, I mean, you talked about Prop 13 and how that affects ownership, but then there's also large renter communities, right? And because they don't have the price stability locked in of at least having a place, even if they can't get out of it because of the tax implications, at least they have a place to live that they're not paying, their rent is not going up every month. And so how, like, has there been a differential impact there? Is that why we hear about the Mission? Are those mostly renters?
I mean, the Mission has obviously a long history. It used to be like an Irish Catholic working class neighborhood, and then shifted over to being more Latino in the 1930s through 60s. They do have a large tenant population there. Yeah, I mean, rent control is a very complicated policy. Like, you'll protect people who are in place, and generally, because the United States has emphasized homeownership over tenancy, this country has the weakest tenant laws and tenant protections of any OECD country. In certain cities that have majority tenant populations, like San Francisco, New York, and in the Bay Area, East Palo Alto, San Jose, Berkeley, and Oakland, tenant organizing has led to tenant protections in these individual municipalities. But at the same time, it can induce people, property owners, to take their rental properties off of the market.
Yep.
So it's a complex policy, and I would say like Prop 13 and rent control in San Francisco were passed within a year of each other, and they are kind of like analogous to each other, but one in the property owner market and one in the renters market.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, and it does seem like the way that rent control also encourages people to sort of age in place, to stay in place, right? Because you've got a place that you have guaranteed rent price, and if you move that, you lose that. It is complicated and has that same impact of protecting certain classes of people, but then other very similar classes of people who probably make similar incomes but don't have that rent-controlled apartment are in a completely different situation. They're thrown into the sort of affordable housing market, which, as you said, is not growing nearly as fast as it needs to grow.
No. Yeah.
I would encourage you all again to check out the Data for Good area in the middle of the venue. Explore what's happening in your neighborhood. I know that the title said Changing Face of America, and we mostly talked about the Bay Area, but you should go check out what's happening wherever you live. Thank you so much, Kim. This was so informative. I learned a lot. I'm sure that the audience did too. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.